Welcome, everyone. This is Debbie Mayberry with National Kitchen and Bath Association. Today's session is called Climate Change Adaptation for Designers with Joe Kane, and he is a consultant with Eco Fitting Your Home. I want to give a shout out to Gebert for sponsoring all of our webinars this month. And Joe, if you're there, we're ready to get started. Thank you.
I am here, and thank you. I'm glad that we have so many people joining us today. I know that many of us are in new environments, perhaps working from home and getting used to a new lifestyle. But I'm glad that you're tuning in. And climate change is something I can really talk about for a long time, but I'm going to do my best to keep it succinct and allow for questions. This format doesn't allow for a dialogue, but it does allow us to field questions that you can type in throughout the conversation. And I will allow time at the end to address anything that you have. Just a quick reintroduction on myself. I spent 15 years running a business called Neo Metals. We made countertops and range hoods for homes and businesses all around the world, actually. Specialized in zinc, copper, and brass. I've since shut down that business and moved into a consulting role where I help people and businesses with management and also sustainable practices. One of those activities brought me to the specialty badge, the sustainability badge for NKBA last summer as a co-author or co-creator of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I did want to mention it up front as something I was pretty involved in. And something that you might consider since you're tuning into today's webinar. I do have some goals for us. I really want you to understand what's driving climate change and how the building industry is contributing to it and how we can adjust our practices to reduce our impact. I want to give you a few actions at the end that you can take to change your business practices, or if you're not a designer or part of the industry in a different role, maybe for a manufacturer or a sales rep, you do still have the option of influencing your sphere of people there. And then also as designers and specifiers, I want to give you a few criteria for product selection. It's always an interesting topic. Because so much of what a designer is doing is helping to shop, helping to choose products. This is our outline, just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to go through. This keeps me a little bit on track and also gives you a roadmap. Most sustainability or climate change conversations start with where we are with the climate, and that's what I'm going to cover as well, and how we may be adapting. And then we get into carbon emissions. You probably already know that carbon emissions contribute a lot to climate change. And so it's going to be part of our focus here. That's where there's a lot of data. But I try and present it to you so that it's easy to take in. And the big one is why you? How can a kitchen designer have some influence over these items? And that's a little bit where I ask you to stretch your mind a little bit, and we'll get into that. Re-electrification is a big thing that's being promoted currently, and I think it's a great solution, so I want to cover that. And then the product selection, as I mentioned, and also how you can be a climate change influencer and activist, so how you can initiate change in the industry. So that's where you want to prepare your notes and get familiar with what we're going to cover. A few of the basics of how do we measure a healthy planet. Primarily it's temperature, which you've heard of global warming for decades. But it's really not just the temperature is getting warmer, it's that we're getting more weather events and unusual weather events that we have to adapt to. When we look at our oceans, we measure the pH level, how acidic it is. And we always have to remember the bottom one, that's the food web. So a lot of our food is also associated with quality of the ocean. So that's those are all tied together, and I want to make sure that everybody has some understanding of what metrics are at play here, so that as you're getting familiar with talking about climate change with clients and colleagues, that you have some frame of reference for all of it. And of course, air quality is also a common issue, and that will be affected by a lot of different things. And the question is, are we ready for disruption? And if you've been living in America for the last month or 2 months, you've seen these sites. And I've spent this is now 30 days where I've been inside my house. I have ventured out, but it's definitely a different lifestyle, and we have adapted, but it is a major disruption, as everybody knows. And the interesting thing is that we have humans have a very hard time understanding disruption like climate change, because climate change is slow moving. It's a little hard to identify the source, and there's something called the bystander effect. So we always have this idea that somebody else is going to take care of it. So the bystander effect was actually established in the 60s, when there was a gruesome murder that was witnessed by many people and nobody did anything. And the idea is that, and it's been studied by Harvard professors and psychologists, that if you have a group of people that witness a crime or an event, 40% of them will raise their hand and stop it. But if you have an individual that witnesses it, then 70% of the time they will react to it. So there's a huge difference of being in a group and witnessing something versus being by yourself and witnessing something. So obviously, if we see an event that is climate change related, and everybody sees it, we think, well, whoever's in charge is going to take care of it. And unfortunately, it's not happening. So here we are. And to get into more of the psychology of it, our bodies, our brains are programmed to react to pain. And this comes from the caveman journey of our history, when we had to react to threats such as animals or fire or other issues that were coming against us. And so if it's not something that is threatening us personally, or it's a quick, abrupt issue, and it's not immediate, then we tend not to look at it. Something immoral is where we witness something that's unfair, like a unprovoked military attack. So that's all stuff that we know how to respond to. Our bodies are programmed to it. But when we look at things like climate change, where it's a gradual changing of weather patterns or a gradual release of gases that cause these weather patterns, we don't see it as a huge threat. So it's something I want to point out to you, because if we're aware of it, the fact that our bodies are like this, our minds are acting like this, then we can help understand it and compensate for it. So it is the sort of thing where you can react once you identify the issue. But if you just recognize that there's nothing really going wrong, then it is hard to make a change in your work. And let's talk disruptions. So climate disruption is part of it, but there's also the technology disruptions. So back in the 80s and 90s, Home Depot disrupted the lumber industry. And if you owned a lumber yard the 80s, you probably did not pass that lumber yard on to your children because there was this big superstore that was coming into neighborhoods, and the growth of that shopping, that retailer really put out a lot of the smaller industry players. And what that means is that the money that those communities had from those lumber yards suddenly was being taken out of the community. And that's, it's nice if you're an investor in Home Depot. It's not so nice if you're living in that community, because your economy is getting reduced. We see this more recently with Uber and Lyft, who have taken the idea of transport and disrupted that, so that a taxi is not something that you just wave your hand to, but you can schedule it on your phone, and you don't have to pay the driver. You don't have to take that money out of your pocket at the moment. And that threatens people like GM and Ford and other car manufacturers, because it changes the idea of ownership. So I bring this up because I think that the kitchen industry is possible for, is ready for disruption. And this is a concept I first brought up, I think, in 2017, when I first started talking about sustainable kitchens. And it was building off of the idea of Stitch Fix. And Stitch Fix is a business that helps you pick out your clothes. So instead of going into a department store and having a salesperson pick out an outfit or two for you, it's all done remotely. And so it's basically a call center that can help you find the right look, and then they send it to you, and you can choose whether you want to keep it or not. And I see that there's a very real possibility that the kitchen industry could do this as well. In fact, the landscape industry is already seeing that with a company called Yard Zen, and there are others that design landscapes for homes without even visiting the property. So suddenly they can scale that design skill and produce a lot more of their creativity without going on site. Now, in 2017, this might have been this was a far-fetched idea. As of the last 2 months, the idea of a kitchen designer doing their work from home and never going to the job site is suddenly a little bit more realistic and more possible. And the idea is that if you could do something like that and make it sustainability focused, and also change the customer experience a little bit, so that they're getting a similar sense of the shopping experience, or the design, the curating experience, then you have that ability to scale the design. So I'm waiting for a startup to come along and take this idea and make it a reality. And if I had a pile of investors behind me, I might be doing it myself. But as of today, I think that you can all understand that it is possible to do some of this stuff without being on site. And this brings us to climate disruption, the traditional how are we facing the world these days? And this picture is from Florida, the Gulf Coast, when they had Hurricane Michael a few years ago. And the house that is remaining was overbuilt, basically. So they took the building code and then they went beyond it. So if the building code says that you have to be able to withstand 115 mile an hour winds, they went up to 150 mile an hour winds. And that meant that the owner had to tell the architect, had to tell the contractors and everybody else to do something that was unusual. So they disrupted their contractors and their tradespeople to say, instead of using traditional materials, we're going to go a little bit overblown on it. But look at what happened. They survived a hurricane that their neighbors did not. And while you can look at that as a success, you do have to consider that we need to start asking the question, of do we really want to build in these areas anymore? And we do have to be ready for that disruption that's probably going to come from the insurance industry to say that they aren't going to insure homes in those areas anymore, and therefore people won't be able to get loans, people won't be able to trade homes there. So that is a threat that I think should be on our horizon, and we understand that a little bit of locating a home or locating where we're living and operating is a question that we should be considering. And flooding is obviously a common issue, and it's something that's becoming more and more extreme and more normal. And it has a huge disruption to communities, especially if it's along a river where the wastewater or water from buildings and plants that are getting flooded suddenly moves downriver and is infiltrating another town, and that town might have their water supply as part of the river. So suddenly our water purification process is burdened, and it starts to snowball. So these are all issues that might be we have to face. The more weather disruption we see is blizzards in areas that are not used to getting snow at all, and drought that may cause crop failure. So there's a threat not just to land use, but also to our food supply. And that can also be with extreme heat. In the lower left corner, you can see that there's an increase in tornado activity throughout the Midwest. And then if you're on the West Coast, you're familiar with that scene of wildfires and the hurricanes. We've seen pictures almost every year like this where there's massive destruction. So as we're considering how to adapt to all this, we have to start to measure this and say that these are the issues that we're going to have to account for. This chart here, this map shows the prediction of 10 feet of sea level rise. And basically it means that most of the southeast United States is going to have a major disruption on major cities like Miami, New Orleans, Houston, parts of North Carolina. And that is just with 10-foot sea level rise. If you listen to the news, you start hearing about ice sheets in Greenland and parts of Antarctica that are melting. And what that means is that those are where the sea level rise is going to form. So if you're in Miami, I would welcome you to start paying attention to the Greenland ice sheet and how that might threaten the community of Miami. And, one of the tricks of fighting sea level rise is to add seawalls and levees. And obviously that's going to be a engineering challenge as well as a financial challenge that will burden the people in those areas because those tax dollars have to pay for it in some way. If we take a look at that concept in a different way, this map shows the entire United States, and the blue indicates where there's direct disruption based on sea level rise, which is all of the coastlines. So if you look at the population of America, you're going to see that most of us, a large percentage of the United States population will be directly affected by sea level rise. And then the dark red, the maroon, is areas that are also affected because the people on the coast have to move somewhere. And this model, which is done by artificial intelligence, actually predicts where people will be moving to. So if you want to think about how to adapt to this one indicator of climate change, which is sea level rise, you'd start looking for a nice chunk of white land to live on. However, there may be other issues that you'd be moving into, such as the wildfires or hurricanes or tornadoes. So there may not be a perfect place to live in the next 80 years, but there may be areas where you can adapt a little bit easier than others. Sea level rise is a hard thing to prevent because water infiltrates everywhere. And likewise, we start to see it with with more frequent high tides, and then eventually those high tides just don't go away. And I think we're seeing that already in a lot of Miami and a lot of parts of Florida as well. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here and just dwell on these threats, but it is something that if we're in the building industry, we really have to start being the experts on all these factors, especially site location. So moving on to our next stage, we're going to learn a little bit more about carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, basically, and how they contribute. So this graph is one that I've shown a number of times, and 2017 is the latest data available as of right now. So you can see the squiggly line and how our greenhouse gas emissions have varied over the last 20 years, to 30 years almost. So it looks like we're on a downward trend, which would put us in a good mood theoretically. However, if you look at the previous decade, from 1975, 1985, we never exceeded 5,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a long way to go to return to to see that we're actually moving downward, because the line at the top, if you really equalize it, it's almost flat. So that means that we're not really having a huge making a big difference on greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are a number of different gases, but carbon dioxide is the largest one and the most commonly talked about one. The next one that is really a threat is methane. And while there's not as much methane being released, methane does have 30 times more potency with regard to warming the planet. And unfortunately, as the temperature rises, especially in parts of Canada that are tundra, frozen tundra right now, permafrost, as that permafrost melts and it releases methane. So the other contributor to methane gases is our love of beef, and we get a lot of methane that comes from cows. As they digest throughout their four stomachs, they release gas that comes out of their mouth mostly, believe it or not. And that is, it's a large contributor. So that's why you start to hear things about meatless Mondays, because people are trying to reduce the amount of beef that they're intaking and the supply of methane. This graph is from NASA, and I think it's a great one. If you look at the bottom, I want to spell this out to you because it's a little, I don't want to say deceptive, but it does put things in perspective. That 400 on the left column, that's 400,000 years ago. So what we have to really understand that the scale of it is dramatic, in that if you look back for hundreds of thousands of years, you will see that our carbon dioxide levels never exceeded 300. And we're now, as of today, up over 400. And you can attribute all of that to the Industrial Revolution. So as we started burning fossil fuels as we started consuming more, and the population has grown dramatically, our carbon dioxide emissions have really increased. And until we make ways to really reduce that in every aspect, we will have an issue. So I want to get into a little bit more of greenhouse gas emissions by industry and basically their sources. So you can see that transportation in the United States is what's driving a lot of it, and that's a little bit outside of our scope in this industry. We can't really tell people to put their Escalade in the junkyard and go find a Tesla, but we do want to understand a little bit of what our leverage points are. And you think, okay, well, commercial and residential, that's a little bit of what we work on. And that's not quite where we have the most leverage point. So electricity is really something that we do have some control over. And if you think about it, we have these homes that use electricity and other energy sources, and then we go off to work in these buildings that are also burning all this stuff. So there's a lot of consumption that we're participating in, and we want a certain lifestyle. So we do want to continue to use electricity. We do want to continue to have warm homes and businesses. However, we just need to shift a little bit of the generation of it. The other thing that has come up quite a bit in the building industry is that people think using reclaimed wood or other reused materials is really going to make a large difference on the sustainability of a home. And unfortunately, that landfill that we're saving is part of that agriculture wedge. So that's where landfills and land use is located. And my premise, my position is that we will have a better, our bigger leverage point is playing with the electricity source. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. If we go back to the idea of greenhouse gas emissions, this chart has a similar line that we saw a few slides ago at the very top, and then it's broken down again by industry. So again, that darker green, the third line up from the bottom, is the agriculture. That's the landfill. That's pretty much a straight line, and it's very low. So again, the electricity generation, the green or the blue, is something that we really do have some control over, and it is something that I want to get into. So why designers? Why designers talking about all of this stuff? Well, why not? I think designers have a great influence over big decisions that people make. If you look at the roadmap that gets us to where we live, you know, at some point people choose a region, and then they choose a city, they choose a neighborhood, and then they find a home. And that basically, that decision tree helps locate all of that, and that's part of what we have to look at as we consider adaptation. So the influencers on that decision tree is climate to some extent. We may not really think about it up front. At some point you might say, I don't want to live with snow, I don't want to live in the heat, etc. I think a lot of times your purchase influencers are your job, where your job is, where your career leads you, where your family is, your friends. And then obviously part of that decision making is the real estate agents having some influence over neighborhoods and homes. The building code does play a role in that. It may not help you choose exactly where to live, but it does have some influence over the building and the home that you're buying. So during the purchase process, those factors at the top are all at play. But once you own the home and you want to reinvest more money into it, it's designers that are having a lot of influence. And that's really where you have your consultation skills. So people look to designers for information and advice and styles. So designers set the styles that people and consumers follow. So if you look at the power of designers, in a particular year, we had 300 million kitchen remodels. And that could be anything from refacing the cabinets to a complete tear out and rebuild. And the data shows that over half of those people used design help of some sort. So at some point, they've consulted with a designer in a Home Depot or a standalone practicing designer or a design build firm. At some point, designers had some influence over those remodels. Now, you might say, well, I only have a handful of clients every year, and there's only a few people that I would really be able to influence. And I would argue look into that a little bit more. Because your web visitors are paying attention to the pictures that you post. Your followers on Instagram and Pinterest and social media are also being influenced by your work, and you're setting the trend, and do-it-yourselfers are looking to you, whether you know it or not, for advice and information. So if we dig into that circle a little bit more of your particular influence, not only do you have your web visitors and followers, but there's also the tradespeople that you work with, and that as you work on a project with them, you might teach them something new that they then take on to other projects. And then there's the manufacturers. So I worked as a manufacturer for 15 years, always trying to make designers happy and sell them what they wanted. And for many years, I said, well, I want to do things sustainably, but the industry isn't demanding it. And I would challenge you to start demanding it now. And I'm not just talking about low-flow shower heads. I'm talking about really getting into the manufacturing process, understanding what manufacturers are doing for their business practices, as well as getting more familiar with energy use. So really, consider this power that you have and then start promoting it. So you could easily be the sustainable expert for kitchen design in your town and shift all of your marketing towards that and shift all of your business practices so that they are more sustainably focused. So what works well? Why is this group of guys very popular on TV? And I would position it as saying that they are looking at the full spectrum of a person. They look at, if you don't know, it's Queer Eye, and they are very enthusiastic designers, and they look at everything from food to clothing and hair to the home and how a person lives. And it's entertainment, but it's also what a lot of people, when they're choosing to remodel their house, they're looking for that improvement. And that's part of what they're after. So I want to encourage designers to start looking at ways that are outside the normal scope of business that they can offer that full spectrum advice. And really take control of the kitchen. So design for energy use. So if you remember the slides about electricity and carbon emissions, we really want to start taking control of the energy of the home, install a long-lasting kitchen, and then recycle the current kitchen. So the idea is that every new kitchen lasts about 16 years before somebody comes along and says it needs a refresh. So if you install a kitchen this year, put your stamp on it and say, call me in 16 years. And suddenly you may have a repeat customer that wants to refresh their kitchen. And you, as the designer of that original kitchen, can say, I know exactly how to recycle this, and I want to move it on to the next phase. So, but let's look at the energy use. So if you look at the kitchen as a system, you have all these different activities that are happening in it. And it's serving people, it's producing waste, it's managing waste, heating food, cooling food, storing food. It's got water, air, and other tools in it. And there's energy in all of them. So there's energy use and how those dishes are being cleaned, to how the people are being fed, and the waste going out the door. So sustainable business practices likes to talk in systems, and the kitchen is a great ecosystem to study. And how it's being powered is really something that I want you to start considering. And that should be electricity. It should be clean, renewable electricity. So a big promotion right now is to get rid of gas. So that means getting rid of the gas stoves that people say, I'm going to be a chef when they install it in their house. Switching to an induction cooktop or stove. In addition, you can look at the other electricity or the other gas that's being consumed in the home, which is a lot of times hot water heaters and furnaces. There are solutions already in place for replacements of this. Doesn't really help us if that electricity that's being consumed is generated by coal or natural gas, because you're just shifting where it's being generated. So my recommendation is to go outside of your normal scope and start promoting renewable energy in addition to the kitchen remodel. And a friend of mine always talked about how some of these things are like getting kids to eat vegetables, and the mechanicals of a house are the vegetables. We don't really want to think about it, and nobody says, honey, let's replace the hot water heater because I think today is a great day for it. I really want a new one. They replace the hot water heater because the other one breaks, and they say, I need a replacement as soon as possible. Give me the same one. But a kitchen is really the cheese that you would put on top of those vegetables to make the kid eat it. And that's where people say, I want the glam, I want the nice looking kitchen, I want the nice tools. And my argument is to use that kitchen as leverage to get them what they want, but also to convert the house to a sustainable living house. So change the power source as much as you can on those products, and it doesn't cost that much more. If you live in a state that allows rooftop solar to be leased to other people, there's a lot of times no additional cost. So companies like Sunrun, where they come on and they put solar panels on your roof, and they own the panels, you pay them a little bit every month, about the same as you would be paying the power company. That doesn't affect the budget of the kitchen at all. It just changes a little bit of where they're writing that energy check to. And you can then put the focus on the products that are powered by that clean burning energy. So that's really where you want to add the drama to a kitchen and to a home. In addition to induction cooktop, you want to switch obviously to LED lighting so that you're not consuming a lot of electricity. There's on-demand hot water heaters that are electric, so you're not burning gas to keep a big pot of water hot all day. And then there's low-flow faucets for people in drought-affected areas or water-scarce areas. And there's something called a heat pump. And I would argue that every home that you're working in right now has a heat pump, and it's the refrigerator. So The refrigerator is the same technology of something called a heat pump, and a heat pump is basically able to heat and cool a home, and it could be electric. So instead of two different units, an air conditioner outside and a furnace inside, you can replace it with a heat pump and effectively operate the climate control system for the home. So this is something that you're going to see more and more of as we get away from burning natural gas in homes. Now, moving on to general sustainability principles. This will help you with product selection. Generally, for sustainability, you want to talk about people, planet, and profit. That's what you want to start looking at your manufacturers for. What are they doing for their people? Whether those people are employees or other stakeholders, you want to make sure that they're factoring in living wages and health benefits, et cetera, for their employees, and that they're not disrupting the planet too much. So start asking them for the triple bottom line instead of just the profits, but the other elements. And then start talking about healthy homes. And a healthy home is one that has good air quality and doesn't consume a lot of energy or has clean burning energy. Transparency is another common element of sustainable business practices that we want to pursue and support. So there are things that we will, ways of getting information on products that create transparency. The sustainability badge from the NKBA does focus a lot on that. So it's one place where you could take a deeper dive. And then obviously we want to have low or no impact on consumption of various products and figure out where those products go at the end of their lives. So we want to help reduce the consumption. If we can upcycle something, we should. And those are all good practices to incorporate into your design, as well as social justice. That's the other thing, is we want to make sure that it's fair and equitable. And unfortunately, a lot of climate change is not fair. Our customers in the kitchen and bath industry are not as likely to be susceptible to the effects of climate change because they have the resources to bolster themselves against any climate issues, as well as moving wherever they like. So it's a little bit of where, if you have that audience of the customers, you can help them influence the climate change disruption so that they are benefiting those that are not able to. If we look at product transparency, you could all be asking for HPDs and EPDs. These are great acronyms, but they're product declarations that show you the health of the product and the environmental impact of products. So many manufacturers already produce these. They talk about off-gassing of volatile compounds. They talk about what goes into the manufacturing of a particular product. So this is one place where you can really become an expert on the products that you specify and start changing the language that you're using with your clients so that they understand a little bit more of what they're putting into their home, and they get more trust that in you, that you're giving them the great advice. So start looking for these and demanding it. And then the idea of recycling a kitchen is really, the first step in any kitchen design is what to do with the old one. And it should be done well before the dumpster shows up at the front of the house. To understand if you can take the old cabinets to a place like Habitat for Humanity's Restore shows or stores. A lot of times there's independent resellers that will take old kitchens. I know of a teacher in Colorado that spends his summers ripping out kitchen cabinets and puts them in his garage and then markets them to people. And it's a great business to be in because there is a market for that. the people buying these kitchens are probably not hiring a kitchen designer, but they do need a kitchen, and they're going to benefit from your specification of great cabinets, great fixtures for that home. So make that a business practice that starts with every conversation, every initial conversation you have. What more can we do? If we look at the systems of a kitchen, we have air, water, and food. That is one of the major aspects of it. The air, we should definitely have no VOC paints involved, and no formaldehyde. And the wood, well, no formaldehyde in any processed wood that we have, and definitely replace the gas with electricity. I know it's a new trend, but it's definitely one that we have to pursue. The building codes are not going to do it for us. They're going to react long after you have an impact. So start doing it, and don't wait for regulation on that. With water, there's a simple low flow faucet. If you don't want to have low flow faucets in the kitchen, then do a swap so that you get their bathrooms. I know filling a pot takes a little bit longer when you have a low flow faucet, but if you have a pot filler, then make sure you're using a low flow aerator on the kitchen sink. And again, on-demand hot water heater, and look for the water sense label on products. For food, again, we want to go to the solar plus electric and look for Energy Star appliances that store food or heat it. Again, I want to show this slide so that you can have a recap of it, just to understand that if you start designing for energy and you install a long-lasting kitchen, you can have that cycle continue on. So if you're on the younger side, the beginning of the career in the kitchen design industry, you definitely can see some of those kitchens come back to you in 16 years. And I think that's something that many designers could consider. And now I want to ask you to take action. There are ways that designers can have a lot of influence. I mentioned very briefly the building code, which I'll get to, but the sustainability badge is probably the first step. Get that on there and start promoting it as something that your clients should be looking for. And that's where you can set yourself apart in your community, is to have that sustainability specialty badge. And as you heard Deborah say, that there's a good deal if it's your first time badge. Even at $200, I think it's a great deal, because it's a simple education that you can all benefit from. And I am a little bit biased on that, but it is good. And then there's the building codes. So one of the comments that I've heard here in California, people have said, well, our building code is so good, we don't need to worry about sustainability. And that's not entirely true. The building code reacts to, is set by people that react very slowly to the industry, and they tend to react to events. So one of the main reasons we have a building code is due to fire hazards, so that we know that buildings built in America have a certain level of safety, and obviously we went through a period where they didn't have that, and that was what helped establish the building code. And building codes are set, they're different in each state, so I can't specify exactly what the pattern is for the whole country. But typically it follows this pattern where there's an advisory council that is appointed by a governor. And that is made up of industry professionals, people like you. And there's no reason why kitchen designers shouldn't be in that panel and having influence over the building code. You don't have to be a structural engineer. You don't have to be a contractor. Most cases, you can be anybody that is appointed by the governor. So that's one place that I really encourage you to get involved in. And if that's not it, then get involved as a voter so that you're helping to advocate for that building code advisory council. You're advocating to get people that you believe in on that council so that they can influence the building code. And the building code can really have some impact on sustainability, specifically with energy use. Here in California, we've got a new law that states all new homes need to have solar power on their roof. And that's a big thing that shifts the conversation in the industry, especially with the power companies having issues with wildfires, but also just with clean energy. So really get involved and start to be a voice. And then these are some other places where you can improve your standing and get familiar with certain certifications that either you can pursue or you can start looking for in products. So Cradle to Cradle is, their logo is a C2C, and often that means that they've planned for the end of life of that product and how it can get upcycled. A B Corporation is a for-benefit corporation, and it allows for the business practices to be beneficial to all stakeholders. So that's something that as a kitchen designer, as a standalone business, you could pursue. You could also start asking your manufacturers about it. They do have a list on their website of manufacturers that have already become B Corp certified. Energy Star, I think, is one of the best success stories for the industry, along with LEED. And then as an alternative association, the National Association of Home Builders offers the Certified Green Professional certification, as well as the NKBA badge. Finally, I want to go back to the simple stuff of ask, teach, and learn. So ask how it's made and really investigate what you're helping specify. And then educate people. This is where you go back to your sphere of influence with your website and your clients and helping people that you don't know you're helping, the do-it-yourselfers. Because if you think for every client that you have, there may be 2 or 3 people that you're influencing. Outside of that, you do have a lot of voice. And then get involved in your community and find out what other people are doing for best business practices on a local and national level. And with that, I want to field any questions. I know I spoke a lot and there's not much time left, but I do welcome the question.
Well, thank you, Joe. This has been fascinating, and I know you spent a lot of time talking about this, and of course, you've been a great resource to NKBA for a sustainable badge, and we do appreciate that. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of questions out here, and so obviously one of them is pointing towards the current worldwide situation with the shelter in place and the fact that it's probably making a significant reduction in greenhouse gases. Now, one person commented that Los Angeles now has the cleanest air in the world, and it used to be one of the worst. I don't mean to be laughing because that's not a funny thing, but so are you thinking that what's happening right now and the stats that you presented, do you see that this would have an effect on the stats that you presented, or do you think it's just a small blip?
Well, of course it has an effect, and it's a great effect, and that's why Los Angeles has that status now. I don't think it's a permanent thing because this summer we will all get back in our cars. And California, that graph of where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from is dramatically more transit oriented. So Californians love their cars, and we do have a hard time with that. So it's not a permanent situation. It's just a brief moment in time. If this shelter in place becomes more of a permanent or frequent activity, I think we will find different ways of moving about. But with air travel is another huge contributor to smog and greenhouse gas emissions, and that's been reduced quite a bit. So it's a small byproduct and a small benefit, but it's not a systemic change.
Okay, I would tend to agree with that. Let's see. So here's a good one. As designers make the shift towards demanding sustainability, do you think certain certifications, such as LEED that you mentioned, will become less of a way to distinguish yourself and more of a standard or requirement? And then how will designers set themselves apart as we move towards sustainability as a standard?
Well, I think that's a great point, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't. It's a little bit of, at some point, one car manufacturer started installing seat belts, and then other manufacturers did it, and then it became law, and all manufacturers did it. So we don't really think about, oh, I want to make sure I buy a car with seat belts. But until then, we do want to set ourselves apart with those certifications. And that is the big point of difference that you can have and help spread that gospel of sustainable business practice, because people will follow it whether they get the certification or not. So I think it's a valid point, but it shouldn't dissuade you from pursuing a certification now.
Okay, so you were talking a little while back about adding solar to houses, and so someone's asking if the house isn't situated in a location to add solar, what would you do?
I would, I'd say that most states in America have enough solar potential to benefit it. One of the issues is that energy is regulated by individual states. So there are some states that are more friendly to coal than others. And that means that solar panels may not make financial sense right up front, but the majority of states, it does make sense. And if a home is positioned under trees or doesn't get enough sun there, then there are ways to locate those solar panels off the rooftop elsewhere on the property if possible. Or the other idea is to get into the energy world. The energy world is a little bit like the building code, in that there's an energy board that helps dictate and control the utility companies. So you can easily start advocating and making your voice heard to those people that are making those decisions. So the alternative is looking at wind energy. Iowa, for instance, has a large production of wind energy. So that means that a lot of the electricity coming into the home is already clean, and all you have to do is switch the appliances. So there are alternatives if you don't have the option of putting solar on the rooftop. And I forgot to mention that when I say solar, I typically just, I mean renewable energy in general, non-fossil fuel burning energy production. So those are a few different ways of dealing with that.
Okay, and so I think one of the things was someone was asking, do you think that there should always be a backup energy source to solar?
Yeah, I think that Sunrun and Tesla both have great batteries that are being used, and those batteries can power a home typically for 2 or 3 days. There's also a lot of discussion about using electric cars as being able to feed a home with electricity, so that you're using that car battery as storage, as additional storage. So definitely use battery backup power. And most of the homes that I'm talking about are also still connected to a grid, so that if your battery is empty, if your storage and production in your house is zero, then you still have access to a grid for safety.
Okay. So earlier on, you were talking about induction cooking, and there's a question here about, do you have any ideas on how to convince clients to go with induction cooking when they're attached to primitive flame?
Yeah. I think that, that's a big thing. And I think a lot of the gas stoves are attractive because that's what we see in restaurants. And we see, oh, I want to be like the chef and have what the chef has. So that is really probably the biggest challenge from a designer standpoint. But I know that designers are creative and they set a lot of style. And I think it comes down to talking about the energy and getting excited about using clean energy. And a lot of times you can position it as being free. If you have solar panels on the roof that are powering your house, once you pay for those panels, you're creating energy without paying for it. So it's a way of using energy independence is a phrase that I think captures a lot of hearts, especially in areas where that independence is a priority. So I do see that as a challenge. I don't want to deny it, but I think that's part of where you have to get people in front of that stove and get them using it, saying, oh, I do see that it cooks faster and more efficient, and I would feel better about using something that's more efficient than gas.
Okay. There was a question in here about recycling countertops, like granite, quartz, stone versus tile, which is typically not salvageable. Do you have any information you could share on that?
Sure. I used to, make metal countertops, which were infinitely recyclable. So I'm still an advocate for that. Typically granite, if you ship it from Italy or, ship it around the world, you're really impacting the environment negatively. So it's one of these materials that may not be the best choice for countertops. Unless you can get it from a local source, and then you can find a local source to take it back. Because typically stone gets broken up into smaller and smaller stones. So a granite countertop might become a granite table, and then after the table, it becomes a roadbed. It's made into gravel, and then it's embedded in asphalt. So it really isn't ever going to be a granite countertop again, but you can find ways of distributing them so that they're still being used for their stone properties rather than just adding to a landfill. But again, the focus really is if you're planning for design, upcycling for a kitchen, and you have a product that people love like granite, but it's not, it doesn't have a second life, then perhaps you do need to look at another material.
Okay. Let's see. There's another one.
As an alternative, just to continue on with that, wood is something that you might consider. I know it's a very strange material for countertops, but people do it. And wood has the inherent property of being a carbon sink, meaning that it's capturing carbon dioxide when the tree is growing and it's holding on to it. So it doesn't release that carbon dioxide. So it's another way of promoting that. And anyway, I just want to mention that as a carbon sink is another consideration.
I love that idea, Joe. That's a great idea, and it's very recyclable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a couple questions here about can you recommend resources for sustainable products? This person said they've done some research, but they're not finding too many products in like luxury catalogs and things like that.
Start talking to the luxury manufacturers. I would say that first, so that they hear you, and then look at B Corp certified businesses. They do have some that are in the building industry. I've seen them at KBIS that are B Corp certified. And then also look at other green directories. They're usually relatively limited on, or they're relatively local. I would say, if anything, if you have a choice, find something that's locally made versus made overseas or made far away. Because just buying local, one, keeps the money in the economy locally, supports everybody in the community, and as well as reducing the transit of those materials. So you're reducing the transportation emissions.
Yes, great idea. So just real quick here, I know we're running out of time, but someone was asking about will creating smart homes contribute to energy savings? I mean, obviously people are doing that now.
I don't think that's going to contribute a lot to energy savings unless we're finding ways of producing the energy that is more beneficial than what we're currently using. I think a lot of the smart home is adding demand for the electricity because we're programming more things with an always-on situation where the smart appliances are staying plugged in and awake, and that they're consuming the electricity. I think the smartest home idea I had was to have a switch right near your door that turns off all the non-critical appliances. So it leaves the refrigerator on, but it turns off all the power strips and computers and everything else that stay running while you're not home. It's a little extreme and hard to find an electrician that's going to do it, but I think that the smart home gives you more ways of measuring your energy use, but it really will have to come down to how is that energy being consumed. And I think with solar providers, you do see a lot of that data on your telephone, on an app that shows what your home is consuming each time. So that's where you're going to see the benefit.
That's a really good point, Joe. So just to close out, because we are running out of time, is there any further reading or websites that you can recommend for people to learn more? I know you mentioned a few things.
Well, I'm happy to be a consultant for them. But, I would say that the Sustainability Badge program that NKBA has does have a thorough, much deeper dive into all of it than I went into today. And I would say that the EPA website is brilliant, and it does have calculators for your greenhouse gas emissions on a home level, so you can enter in your power bills and get a sense of how much of a carbon footprint you have. So that's more of the operations. If you're just shopping, then I would look at websites that are like Conservation Mark, where they're focused on eco-friendly products. I know that there's a lot of different sites. They have everything from low-flow aerators to heat pumps, and I can't advocate for one versus the other, but I think that just getting familiar with that and then building a library of resources that a designer can choose from is going to benefit them. And instead of saying, well, these are the ones I've worked with in the past, you say, these are the ones I've chosen because they're sustainably focused. And I'm going to figure out how to work with them the best, because that helps you build your business as the sustainable designer in your area.
That's an excellent idea. I like that idea, Joe. And once again, I want to thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all the questions, but I want to thank you so much for providing your time, your expertise, and again, thanking Geberit for their sponsorship. And
thank you. I enjoy it. Obviously, I like to talk about this stuff.
I know. It's all good stuff. And I hope everyone has a great day and stay safe. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.